The problem really began in 2010 and 11. Greece, Goldman Sachs, an American firm, had falsified, worked with a Lucas Papademos, a central banker in charge of Greece Central Bank, to make it appear as if Greece's debt was much smaller than it was. And they did this by doing a derivatives trade that made millions of dollars for Goldman Sachs. So as a result of the euro, huge amounts of loans were made to the Greek oligarchy. These are the richest 1%. When people say the Greeks ran up debt, what they mean is a bunch of crooks that are as crooked in Greece as the Russian kleptocrats put in power just a group of tax avoiders and others. Well, finally, in 2010, when Papandreou won on the socialist ticket, he said, look, here's the real fact of how much we owe. We owe about 45 billion euros, and we also find out that the IMF official, Christine Lagarde, sent a list of Greek tax avoiders who had 50 billion euros just in Switzerland alone. So basically, Greece said, look, the amount of debt that we have to pay, we can't. We'd like to pay. There's no money to pay. So there has to be a debt write-down. The International Monetary Fund, which is always run by a Frenchman by practice, and at that time was written by the Sex Party man, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, the IMF analyst said, look, Greece cannot pay the debts. They're fictitious debts. We need the bondholders to take a loss of about $100 billion. The European Central Bank said, wait a minute, if you say that Greece can't pay the debts, then we say, let them just lower wages. Let them cut wages in half. Half the population can move out of the country. And if you don't say this, IMF, we won't let you be part of it. Well, then Dominique Strauss-Kahn wanted to run as president of France, and French banks were the largest holders of the Greek debt. So Strauss-Kahn overruled the IMF and said, we're going to lend the Greek government the money to pay French bondholders and German bondholders. Not a penny will go to Greece, but we have to bail out. And there was still a little argument. You know, there was, the heads of the IMF's European economic team resigned and went to the press and said the IMF is, falsifying the data. The board disagreed, and matters got much worse in 2010 when Obama and Geithner went to the G8 meetings with Angela Merkel of Germany and the French, and told the Greeks, look, American banks have made huge bets, derivative bets, that the Greeks will pay. If the Greeks default and don't pay the unpayable debts, then American banks have bet so much money on this horse race that they're all going to go broke. You have to, the European Central Bank and IMF, have to lend them enough money to pay the bondholders. So all this gigantic debt that the Greeks owe was not used by Greeks. It was used to pay Obama's campaign contributors and the French banks and the German banks. And the price was that they've increased unemployment to 50% of youth under 30. And it was basically the youth who came in and began voting after about 3 o'clock in the afternoon yesterday that swung the whole tide against succumbing to Europe. There's a myth that somehow Greece has to leave the euro or the eurozone. That was spread by the European Central Bank that said, I, the head of the European Central Bank, Jean-Claude Juncker, will kick you out of Europe. But there's no way that anyone can, that a bureaucrat who's a bank lobbyist, who's put in specifically, by the anti-labor group, one unelected bureaucrat can't kick any country out of Europe. Greece is not going to be kicked out of Europe by not paying the IMF. When I met there 2 weeks ago, the Syriza Parliamentary Committee had just published what they called the debt Truth Commission. And they found that most of this debt was fictitious and what they call legally odious. They've decided not to pay a penny to the IMF, not to pay a penny to the European Central Bank, that this money was fictitiously created just electronically to take all of the private debts, pay the bondholders, so that they made a killing. People, investors, insiders of the Obama administration on Wall Street made billions of dollars because the market had priced Greek debt at about 33%, 20%, hardly anything, and all of a sudden the bonds were all paid off at their full face value. So it made fortunes for speculators. And now the Greeks are saying, well, you have to lower your incomes by enough to pay all of these debts. The equilibrium price of labor will be wages must be cut by 80%, and 70% of the Greeks have to emigrate very quickly, including almost everybody under 40. This is the death trap that they all realized, and it took the last 6 months have been used basically by Tsipras, the head of Greece, and Yanis Varoufakis, explaining to the Greeks just the kind of mess that the bankers have put them in, and the American press and the European press didn't want to believe it. If you read the press all last week, they said, oh, there's going to be a yes vote. It's going to be overwhelming. Finally, the government's going to fall. And they were just writing what they hoped would happen. There was no attempt at all to gauge the reality on the ground. And I could see in Athens and in Delphi, the places I was, that the Greeks knew what was happening, and what they were going to do was say, look, we're not going to bail out the corrupt oligarchy that ran up the debts. If Europe wants to collect the money, let it go to the oligarchs' funds in Switzerland, all of the tax evasion, let them get it from the oligarchs, but no country, in principle, no sovereign country, should be obliged to commit economic suicide, to sacrifice its economy, and to do what the central bank really wants. And the central bank said, you have to sell off your entire public domain. You have to sell off your islands to the Germans or other foreign investors. You have to sell off your gas rights, but not to the Russians. You have to sell them not to the highest bidder, but to the lowest bidder, if that's what we tell you, because the system of the Greek privatizations is as corrupt as it is in Russia. And the Greeks didn't want any part of it. They said, "Oh my God! If the public domain, if the Parthenon is sold, if all these other things are sold off to pay the debts that crooks ran up, then we can't afford to live here anymore." And that's really what the election is about. And there has not been a word of that in the today's press releases by the New York Times or other papers.
Michael, a very distinguished economist, Joseph Stiglitz, stated that according to an ATTAC Austria study, 77% of this big debt, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, quote, provided for the so-called Greek bailout, went to the financial sector and not the people. I quote, went to the financial sector. So when we are hearing, they owe $366 billion, that's the highest I've heard less. That money, the Greek people didn't receive $366 billion. It was the oligarchs and the corrupt people you mentioned, but also it was the way that these banks play games by creating debt, and then that becomes what the country is responsible for. The World Bank's been doing that for a long time. So what are the options for the Greek people at this moment to go forward? What do you see the likely outcome to be since you've been speaking with them?
Well, there's a basic mathematical principle at work. Debts that can't be paid won't be. There's no money to pay the debts. Even if there was a party that were to come into power that wanted to pay, there's no money to pay. So there's no question the debts can't be paid. Apparently, quite a few American hedge funds, like Paulson's fund, bet tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars that somehow the Greeks would pay. They've lost, and that's sort of shaken up Wall Street, but there can't be paid. Now, the question then is, what is Europe going to do about it? for Greece, none of this need be a problem at all, because as you just pointed out, the money that was created to lend to the bondholders, not even to the Greek financial sector, not to the Greek oligarchs, but to the French, German, and American bondholders, all this is created on a computer. When Greece says we won't pay the IMF or the European Central Bank, that doesn't mean that pension fund holders or investors are going to lose the money. It means that electronic credit is going to be canceled. So none of this need be a problem at all. It's a completely artificial problem created by the fact that the real aim of Europe is not to get Greece to repay the debts, but to use debt leverage to say, you can't pay, fine, begin selling off your natural resources and your public domain. And the Greeks are not going to sell it. They're not going to privatize. And they're going to try to have business as usual and tell Europe essentially, okay, we're not going to pay. What are you going to do about it? And I don't know what Europe can do about it, except maybe push a coup d'etat. As long as Greece doesn't, I think the Americans went over, State Department officials went over there recently and said, well, as long as you don't play games with Russia and try to withdraw from NATO, then, do pretty much whatever you want. But it was the Americans that pushed in the military dictatorship originally a few decades ago. So the Greeks are a little worried about what foreign countries will do. But the idea now is that, the European Central Bank tried to frighten the Greeks last week by saying, we will create chaos if you try to withdraw. We're going to not give the banks any notes to print out. We're going to wreck the banks. Well, the Greek Syriza response is, the banks are how the oligarchs have been running the country all along. If you want to collapse the banks, that's fine. Then we'll take them over. We'll use them as a public option. We'll offer banking services at low credit card rates. We'll pay depositors. We're not going to make corrupt takeover loans. We're not going to do money laundering like the banks do. You want to wreck the banks? The fact is you can empty them out of money, but they're still there. We'll take over. We're going to print either our drachmas or we'll print our own script, just like Jerry Brown did in California. Very simple. They're going to get by one way or another, and the Greeks had enough faith in the government that they voted into office democratically, that they think, well, do what you want, we're going to get by.
Last, I need a short answer for this. Isn't it rather hypocritical that the very financial institutions like Goldman Sachs and Bank of America, others, the Deutsche Bank, that were virtually dead at the beginning of the financial crisis and received huge infusions from the Federal Reserve, all told between 16 to 21 trillion, depending upon Ron Paul and Bernie Sanders' audit figures, and got at zero interest, 0.2%, 0.25, which is zero interest, and got to relieve themselves of their toxic assets. They got a start over. We don't give any student loan start overs. That would only be $1.2 trillion. And now that Greece is asking, forgive all this debt. Let's start from scratch. We're saying no, and yet that's exactly what they did in the banking community and Wall Street community here in the United States.
That's because the banks here are the largest campaign contributors to both political parties, and they get to name and nominate, or at least block, any Federal Reserve official or Treasury official that they don't think is on their side. So what really is at stake is, what kind of a world are we going to have? Are we going to have a world that's run by the financial interests in a predatory, extractive way, or are we going to run a world based on how the real economy works and for the 99% instead of the 1%? It's really, finance is the new form of warfare. It's the new way of acquiring land or raw materials or monopolies. And the Greeks realize that they're at war. And in a war, you have a right to defend yourself against the aggressor, and the demand for debt repayment by privatizing their economy is an act of financial war, and they're finally realized that there is a war going on, and they're fighting back. And I think they realize it more than America realizes that there's also a financial war here.